So today we're working through 1 Samuel chapter 4, and the chapter divides into 3 parts, and so we're going to handle each third. It's like 3 different little stories or accounts. So this first story is basically the first 10 verses, has to do with Israel's army and the ark. And I want to go to the next slide where I give you some background. These are instructions that and commands that God provided having to do with warfare. God knew that Israel would be going to war often, and He wanted them to be ready, and He provided them everything they needed to actually, literally, win every battle they ever fought. So I just want to run through these really quick. These are promises given to them. Now it shall be if. Notice the if. This is a conditional promise. If you do this, Israel, then I will give you victory in every battle. Condition. It shall be if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all His command which I am commanding to you today, that the Lord your God will put you high above all the nations of the earth. God's intent was that Israel would be the most powerful nation. If 2 other countries wanted to make a treaty, Edom and Moab want to make a treaty, the first question, well, yeah, but what will Israel think? That's how it should be, how it should have been. The next verse, the Lord will cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated by you. They will go out against you 1 way and will flee at your presence 7 ways. So any attacks, they immediately scatter and run. The Lord will make you the head and not the tail. This continues to talk about international relations between Israel and their neighbors. You will be the head. You will not be the tail. You will only be above and not underneath if you listen to the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am commanding you today to follow them carefully. The next one. The Lord your God walks in the midst of your war camp to save you, that's defense, and to defeat your enemies before you, that's offense. So your camp must be holy. Let me not stop there. So, in Israel's history, God was intensely present on His throne in heaven. He was also intensely present hovering over the ark in the Holy of Holies. And when they went to war, He would be intensely present in a third place, right in the middle of the camp. He goes to war with them. He is their offense and their defense. And all of that works great as long as the second half of this verse says, your camp must be holy. He must not see anything indecent among you, or he will turn away from you. So the goal of the soldier, if you're in the Israel army, was not focus on getting your sword sharp, stuff like that. It was focus on being a godly person. If this camp is godly, God will be there. He will be guarding the perimeter. He will lead the attack. If you're not godly, He's going home. He won't be there. It's all on you. And that's how the law of Moses set out the instructions for how Israel was to wage war. Next slide deals with the problem that chapter 4 starts in the wrong place. And most people agree with that. The very first line excuse me, of the chapter belongs to chapter 3. So this slide gives you the last paragraph of chapter 3. And it's telling us that Israel, for the first time in hundreds of years, now has a prophet who is the leader for the whole country. All through the book of Judges, they had regional leaders. But no one was helping all the 12 tribes work together. That has all changed for the first time now in a long time by way of Samuel. Samuel grew and the Lord was with him. He let none of his words fail. And all Israel from Dan, that's at the far north, even to Beersheba, that's the city at the far southern end, knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord appeared again at Shiloh because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So the word of Samuel came to all Israel. That's how that paragraph works. Unfortunately, they chopped the chapter off, chapter 3 off, and left out that first line. Then we end up with that first line of chapter 4, which makes a lot of people think Samuel sent Israel out to war in the next verse. And that's not at all the case. In fact, we're going to see that clearly Samuel wasn't involved at all in what's going to happen next. So now we're ready for the first account, 1 Samuel 4, 1 through 10. So I guess that you have that up yet? So next slide. No? You have it on the right slide. Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle, and they camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped in Aphek. So this is a battle that's going to take place about 20 miles away from where the tabernacle is, in Shiloh. This is at the central west coast of Israel that this battle is going to take place. The Philistines, verse 2, drew up in battle formation to meet Israel. When the battle spread, who won? The Philistines won. Well, that's not supposed to happen. Israel was defeated by the Philistines. In fact, they killed 4,000 men. 4,000 Israelites died. When the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines?" Do we know why? They weren't being godly. They had a problem. They had a spiritual problem. It wasn't a problem with their armor or their swords or their generals. They were disobeying Deuteronomy 28. They had all the instructions they needed, and they clearly were ignoring them. God was not there. He left. There was too much impurity in the camp. So they had to come up with a solution. Here's their idea. Let's take the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh, so that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. Let's use the ark as a lucky charm. If we bring the box out of the tabernacle, which they're never supposed to do, and bring it into battle, then God will have no choice but to do what we want. Yes, we can be godly, but that's a lot of work. Let's just do the box thing. It's a nice shortcut. Verse 4, so the people sent men to Shiloh. Again, that's a 20-mile walk. And from there they carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of armies, who is enthroned above the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, remember he's the high priest, these are his two sons, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And as the ark of the covenant of God was coming into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, this is the next slide, at least on mine, they said, "What does the noise of the great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. So the Philistines were afraid, and they said, "God has come into the camp." Were they right? No. God hovers over the ark when it's in the Holy of Holies. When they're going to move it, the only reason the ark can or should ever leave the Holy of Holies, they put a special covering on it. God removes his presence. They take the tabernacle down. It's a giant tent. And then everything moves to their next campground. But other than that, the ark is never to leave. So now they have tremendous impurity and sin in the camp, and They've broken most of the laws that have to do with the ark. So things now are much worse. So how would you think the next battle would go? Not well. The Philistines were afraid, saying, God has come into the camp. Let me keep moving. I want to pick up at verse 10. So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. Every man fled to his tent, and the defeat was very great. For 30,000. The first battle they lost 44,000. Now they lose 30,000 Israelites of Israel fell. So Israel's approach was, we could be godly, work on that. And if you remember, the very first battle that Israel carried out in the Promised Land was against Jericho. Couldn't think of the name. Jericho. And 100% success. How many people remember the second battle? Ai, good. And they lost. Anyone remember why they lost? There was sin in the camp. So God didn't go with them. So the people not only have Deuteronomy 28 that tells them precisely how to win every battle, they even have an example in their, let's see, their Bible is now 7 books long. The 6th book of their Bible, the book of Joshua, gives the account that says, here's what you do when you lose a battle. You stop everything. You have a huge time of national repentance and prayer and focus. That was the solution. And of course, they didn't do it. We kind of laugh at the idea of good luck charms, most of us. I remember as a kid, I had friends who carried a rabbit's foot on them. I don't know if you remember that as a kid. I don't think that happens anymore. I guess we carry phones instead. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, I suppose so. And Christopher's around the neck. We had a boat for a while, and it had a plaque on it that said, "Oh God, my boat is so small and your ocean is so great. Have mercy on us, St. Christopher." The prior owner was Catholic, and so the plaque was going to, stop the boat from sinking. The thing about good luck charms is they're supposed to always work no matter what you're trying to do. So if you were a thief, you'd wear a St. Christopher so you wouldn't get caught by the police, right? That's the idea of a good luck charm. It has to make things go your way no matter what. Well, in that sense, God is a terrible good luck charm. God always does what's best, not what you want. That's very different than a good luck charm. But as silly as we think they are, let me talk just a minute about how it leaks into the church. At the first church when I was a pastor, this is back before my professor days, we had the youngest elder on the elder board. He was maybe 40-ish. And his oldest son got his driver's license. Very exciting. 2 hours after passing the test, he went out for his first drive by himself and drove into a tree and died. His family wouldn't come back to church for 3 years. They had no interest in God. This is an elder of the church. Because they had an unspoken arrangement with God. Trouble is, they forgot to tell God about it. Their assumption was, if we live a good life and we tithe, God will always keep our children safe. Most Christians along the way develop an unspoken agreement with God And it's just, we don't have to talk about it. God knows about it. We've given him an assignment. And he has to follow through. It took this family years before they would even come back to church, let alone do any kind of, leadership or anything like that. So I want to challenge us. We have found a sneaky way as Christians to come up with our own good luck charms. There are unspoken arrangements with God. And I used to have a couple of them. And I encourage all of us to think about that. Any questions about that idea? I wouldn't think so. Let's go ahead. I've got a couple of applications I want to share at this point. The first one obviously being, watch out for unspoken relationships with God. And I'm now, maybe I'm on the next slide. Oh, good for you. So my first one, application number 1, watch out for your unspoken arrangements with God. You probably have one if you haven't worked it through yet. Number 2, obey then trust. So we have a song, Trust and Obey. In this case, the army needed to trust. They needed to obey first. They went into war as a disobedient army. God could not and would not be in that camp. And he was not going to do what he had promised to do because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. First, do the right thing, then trust God that he's going to come through. I think that's the way they should have operated. You obey and then trust God for the results. Now we're ready for the second section. And next slide, this is 1 Samuel 11 through 18, and I need to do some background. I want to do some background, good on the slide, having to do with the high priesthood. So Aaron was the first high priest, the brother of Moses. Most people have heard of Aaron. Some people have heard that Aaron had 4 sons, and so do the guys that are listed there. Something happened. Go to the next slide. Anyone remember what happened to Nadab and Abihu? Within a year of being priests under their father, the high priest, they got creative and imaginative in the temple. And they brought before God what's called strange fire. They broke a whole bunch of rules. We don't know exactly what it was. What we do know is that they broke a whole bunch of rules about being a priest and about bringing sacrifices and incense to the most holy God, who was literally only 3 feet away behind the curtain. And they died immediately. In that one act, half the population, half the future population of Israel's priesthood completely disappeared. 2 out of 4 sons are gone. You'll see the blue box, that blue shaded box, that shows where the high priesthood went after Aaron. So, since the oldest and the second oldest sons were killed by God, Aaron's 3rd son, Eleazar, became the high priest. He's talked about in the Bible, not a huge amount, but his son is talked about a huge amount. Phinehas the first. We call him Phinehas the first because he was an amazingly wonderful priest. There's a later Phinehas who's a terrible priest. So the smart people decided they had to have a Phinehas the first and Phinehas the second, so we knew which we were talking about. And I want to talk about him for just a minute. Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron. When they were about to go into the promised land, they were out on the edge of the country, the nation of Midian. And they were in that location for a little while, and the men of Israel started visiting the Midianite camps. And they got interested in two things: Midianite gods and idols, and Midianite women. And it got worse and worse, and God brought a plague on Israel. I don't know how many. Egypt had 10. Israel had almost as many by the time they finally were done getting to the land. And this was another one. And they realized they were doing something wrong. So they decided, the leadership, including Moses, decided they should gather everyone in front of the tabernacle and have a time of intense prayer so that God could guide them into what to do next. While they were sitting there in their prayer time, they're surrounded by a number of tents of families. While they're in their prayer meeting, a man in one of the tents that you could visibly see while you're sitting there if you opened your eyes during your prayer, went and got a Midianite young lady. And during the service, he didn't feel a need to be at the service, he brought her into his tent for a visit. Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, saw it, and during the prayer went and got a spear and went into the tent and ran a spear through the man, through the woman, into the ground. And God said, we just solved the problem. And God said, I'm now going to end the plague. You've finally done the right thing. The right thing was actually adultery, having an affair for Israel was a capital offense. They should have been executing men. That's what they should have been doing all along. And once Phinehas executed the first guy, God said, okay, now I know we're on the right track. And God ended the plague right then and there. Because of that, God made a covenant, an eternal agreement with just Phinehas and his descendants. And that's the next slide. I'm going to read it to us. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has averted my wrath from the sons of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore he's saying to Moses, therefore, Moses, say this to Phinehas, behold, I am giving him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and his descendants after him, a covenant of a permanent priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the sons of Israel. Notice there are no ifs in this covenant. This is an unconditional covenant. Phinehas doesn't have to do anything good or bad. His descendants don't have to do anything good or bad. God is so impressed with what Phinehas knew to do that he has created this awesome agreement between himself and all of Phinehas' descendants. And that shows on the next slide. The high priesthood from now on will go through Phinehas. And all of his descendants will have extra blessings and prosperity in their lives. It's actually called a covenant. In the text it says covenant of peace, but in Hebrew it's the covenant of shalom. So it's really peace and prosperity. Phinehas' descendants will be the priests that everyone looks up to, even the other priests, is the idea. The next slide shows where Eli, who's in the story we're now reading, comes into play. And you'll see that Eli is actually a descendant of the fourth son of Aaron. And the role of high priest somewhere along the way has moved from Phinehas over to Eli. What that means is that Phinehas somewhere had a son or a grandson or a great-grandson that was a massive disappointment to God. And even though God has a permanent covenant with Phinehas' descendants, he is willing to temporarily withhold the enjoyment of the covenant until a good guy shows up. And then the covenant restarts again. That is actually what's happened to Israel. Israel has a Davidic covenant, which is an eternal promise that there will always be a man ready to serve on the throne of David. A descendant of David will always be ready to be Israel's king and serve on the throne. Well, the throne of David has been vacant now since about 500 BC. The problem has been there hasn't been a son of David who's spiritually qualified to be that person. There are probably descendants of David living in Israel right now. We don't know who they are. Israel lost track of who's in which of the tribes. So we don't know who the tribe of Judah is, let alone who David's descendants are. There's probably one, and God would know who they are. But the people aren't qualified to enjoy the Davidic covenant right now, and they haven't been for, what, 2,500 years. But if they ever got their act together, God will put a descendant of David who has his act together on the throne over Israel. And the Old Testament promises that that will happen someday. Does anyone know a descendant of David who has his act together? Most of us know him. Jesus Christ. So he's waiting, but right now he has no one to sit on the throne over. No decent group of people yet. In Israel, at least. So we got Eli onto our little chart, and we're going to add more to it. Next, I got to read this is bad. So Eli and his sons have been doing so poorly that God is now going to put a curse on Eli's descendants. So unfortunately, it's a negative mirror image of what God did with Phinehas. And I want to read it to you. You've already read it because it's in 1 Samuel 2. But I'm going to read it. Behold, the days are coming. And this is God talking directly to Eli by way of a prophet. Again, we read this a couple weeks ago. Behold, the days are coming when I will eliminate your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. This is called a curse of decline. Your line will get weaker and smaller and have more and more bad luck. And it's because of Eli and his sons. You will look at the distress of my dwelling. While Eli's line is in charge of the tabernacle, as they are at this moment, it will be in disrepair. Being a priest as a descendant of Eli will be a struggle. You will look at the distress of my dwelling in spite of all the good that I do for Israel, and there will never be an old man in your house. Your descendants will never retire. They will die instead. Yet I will not cut off every man of yours from my altar, so that your eyes would fail from weeping and your soul grieve. I'm not eliminating your descendants. That would be too much grief for you. So I'm not going to do that. However, all the increase of your house, every new boy that gets added to your family line, will die in the prime of life. I'm not eradicating your line, but they won't have a good time. I don't know how else to say it. They won't have a good time. And this is the sign. Now he's giving them a signal. This last verse is your signal that I, God, am serious about this. This is not a threat. This is the real thing. Here's the signal. Verse 34. It shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. It shall be the sign to you. On the same day, both of them will die. That's how you know that this is the real deal. Go to the next slide, if you would. And we get, you see Phinehas and Hophni are over there. And you see red. Red is bad on this slide. And unfortunately now, Eli's line, all his descendants will be participating in the covenant of decline. Now we're ready for the next passage. So this is the second section of the chapter. So we're going to read the text. Moreover, this is picking up the story. Remember, 30,000 guys have been killed. Their master plan of forcing God to do what they wanted by bringing his box into the battle didn't work. Moreover, the ark of God was taken. The Philistines carted off the ark. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So very next verse, they're dead. Now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line, so he's going to jog 20 miles back to Shiloh, where the tabernacle is, now without its ark. And he came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came back, behold, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, keeping watch, because his heart was anxious about the ark of God. And the man came to give a report in the city, and all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, he's not in the city, he's on the edge of the city at the tabernacle. What does the noise of this commotion mean? Then the man, the Benjamite, came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were fixed. That either means his eyes couldn't turn left to right, the muscles were gone, or he couldn't focus. It's probably one of those two. His eyes were fixed and he could not see. The man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And he said, how are things, my son? Then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. And your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark has been taken. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. Because he was old and heavy, he judged Israel for 40 years. Eli was the second to last judge. He was both a judge and high priest. The very last judge, according to the Bible, is Samuel. Samuel will be judge and prophet. So how did Eli get so fat? Samuel, the book tells us how he got so fat. He's very fat, so when he leans back, maybe the legs on his little chair broke, but he was too much for the chair. And the weight was such that his neck broke when he hit the ground. Let me read these verses to you from 1 Samuel 2. If an Israelite bringing a sacrifice before Eli's sons, Hophni or Phinehas, said to him, no, you need to burn the fatty portions first, then you can have what's left. So the fattest, most marbled, best tasting meat was set aside for God to enjoy. So you would burn it, the smell would go up, and God would smell it, and that's how God participated in the sacrifice. But Hophni and Phinehas were basically like gangsters, and they said, no, 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 we're eating the best part, the fattest part. We're going to eat all that. We'll give God the leftovers. If the Israelite bringing the sacrifice was semi-godly and knew a little bit about the law of Moses, they would say, no, you can't do that. And Hophni and Phinehas would say, you give us the meat, we're going to take it from you by force. So basically they were gangsters more than priests. So Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli were eating very fatty meat their whole life against the law of God. They were breaking the law, eating God's meat. A little later, God says to Eli, why are you showing contempt for my sacrifice, which I have commanded for my dwelling? Why are you honoring your sons over me by making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel? So now we know why Eli had a weight problem. It's called disobeying the law of Moses. So I want to show the next slide. Yeah. We're getting lots of lightning bolts, and they're kind of heavy over to one side. Are you noticing that? That's because of the curse of decline. So Eli and his two sons all died within hours of each other. Here's my application from the section, the next slide. Number one, sin has consequences. We've seen a couple kinds of sin. Eating the meat that belongs to God has consequences. You get fat, and when you fall over, your neck breaks. That's a consequence of sin. Going into battle, depending on the ark rather than on your personal holiness, is a sin. And it had consequences, i.e. 30,000 men dying. So sin has consequences. Number two, obey, then trust. Phinehas and Hophni should have said, well, this is a bummer. I mean, we're going to go our whole lives looking at this meat, but we have to give the best part to God. That's not right. Well, you should obey, and then trust God. He'll figure out how to take care of your diet. He'll find you some meat that you like. Don't eat his meat. Obey, then trust. Now we come to the third story, the third account, because it's a real story. The account of Eli's daughter. It's actually his daughter-in-law. It's the woman who married Phinehas II. And she's the closest thing to a hero in this chapter. She's the one the closest to being a decent, godly person. Unfortunately, she's having a very difficult life because of everyone else's sin, because of the sins of her father-in-law and her husband and her brother. She has a very difficult life. I don't know if you remember, we found out that Phinehas and Hophni, the two sons of Eli, even though at least one of them was married, they were regularly having affairs with the women who cleaned the tabernacle. You're the wife. Everyone knows this is going on. You're famous because your husband is the son of the high priest. Everyone knows your story. And your story is extremely humiliating. So she had a lot of things going against her. She was married to a horrible man. And on and on and on it went. Her appearance in the Bible is so brief, we don't even get her name. So we don't have a name for her. But her character is what sets her apart from everyone else in the chapter. If you go to the next slide, we get a little bit more on priests and stuff. And I see some names got chopped. I didn't realize that was going to happen. But anyway, yeah, that's not that easy to read. Anyway, you can see Phineas has two sons. His oldest son is Ahituv. See that guy up there? He's going to participate in the curse of decline. And he has a younger brother named Ichabod. See that to the right of Ahituv? Ichabod. You can see that Ichabod is not going to be a high priest. It's his brother Ahituv that's going to be the high priest. You can see that. And the story we're reading actually is about the birth of Ichabod to Phinehas' wife. That's the account we're about to read. And the next slide gives us the story. It's 1 Samuel, and this is the shortest story, 1 Samuel 4:19 to 22. Now his daughter-in-law, his being Eli, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God had been taken, and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, think about that. Your husband dies, your father-in-law dies, the ark that's the center of your world almost, as in her position, is gone. At that point, she kneeled and gave birth. Somewhere it's believed, I forget how we know this, that she was 7 months pregnant. And labor just started after all these deaths and everything. As she was dying, well, that's not making the story any more cheerful, is it? She's dying as she gives birth to Ichabod. The women say to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son." They would say that because the most important job of every woman in Israel was to get married and have a male son. That's how the name of your clan, of your family, was carried on. There would have been a number of women that actually would willingly die if that's what it took for that to happen. That's how important it was if you were a woman. And that was the same for both their culture and other cultures as well. So to us, it doesn't make sense. But as she's dying, the helpers around her say, "Good news, it's okay, everything's okay. You're birthing a son while you die." So to us that's strange, but for her it made sense. She named the boy Ichabod. So this is where the name Ichabod first comes from. And glory is kabod in Hebrew. Ichabod is not glory or no glory. She decided while she was dying, of course there's no husband to help pick the name, that she should name her son No Glory in honor of the ark, actually. The thing that was most on her mind as she's dying is the fact that the ark is gone. More than her husband dying. And she named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God had been taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband." So she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God has been taken." This is a really sad story, right? She has a really hard life. She dies giving birth to a son the day her husband dies. Had she lived, she might have even been relieved that her husband died. He was that terrible of a person. But it's bad all around. So I want to, as we wrap up, I want to talk briefly about what you do and what she hopefully did and should have done with a terrible story like this. What she needed was a long perspective. What I mean by that is, if we were to talk to her today, we would ask her in heaven, So how's your life? I think she'd say, it's pretty awesome. She's been in heaven if she died at age 30, 35 maybe, she's been in heaven now for about 3,000 years. So the 30 years she spent on earth was 1% of her current lifespan. So the first 1% of her life was really bad, and it's been amazing ever since. 1 trillion years from now, the first 30 years, which then is what? 1% of her life was awful, and it's been amazing ever since. That's having a long perspective on life. And I think she has it now. I don't know if she had it then. But we can develop that now. We can realize that if we have really hard things in our life, the percent of our life that we're going to be on earth is so tiny, percent-wise. It's even smaller than the number of days you were in the hospital getting born compared to the 80 that you're going to be alive. Think about that. How tiny was that? Let's say you had a really horrible time in your first 2 days in the hospital. Let's say you're now 60, things are going good. If I come to you and say, so how are things? What are the chances you'd say, awful? Oh, those first 2 days. Oh, it was terrible. I can't get over it. I don't think you would. You have a longer perspective. Well, God wants us to have a long perspective. That's one thing that she could have and should have done, and it's something we should do. The other thing is to have a wide perspective. See the bigger picture on earth of how your life, no matter how hard it is going to make a huge difference somewhere, somehow. And to show you that, I want to pull up the next slide. Good. And again, my wording is all screwed up. But notice there's a green guy, which is Phineas's, well, I'm going to say Phineas's wife's great-grandson. His name is Abiathar. Abiathar was one of the 3 greatest high priests that ever lived. Even though he's from the Ithamar line, even though he's under the curse, he was one of the greatest 3 that has ever lived. Him, Aaron, and Phineas are the 3 greatest high priests in all the Bible, in the line of Levi. Jesus is in the line of Melchizedek, so that's different. Ahimelech had a really bad experience. Ahimelech, at the peak of his life, made a courageous decision. Ahimelech, I don't know if you can find it, but he's right above Abiathar. Do you see where he is? He's the grandson of Phineas' wife. He made a very brave decision. He was the high priest during Saul's kingship. He made the very brave decision to side with David, even though David was running around in the desert just trying to avoid being killed by Saul. Ahimelech decided to side with David, and probably would say that was the right thing to do. But he died in the prime of life, in keeping with the curse. Saul found out that his high priest, Ahimelech, was actually helping David. And Saul had every priest killed that he could find. And the line of Ahimelech was almost completely wiped out in Ahimelech's prime of his career. The one that escaped of something like 80 priests who were going to be slaughtered and were slaughtered, the only one to escape was one son of Ahimelech named Abiathar. Abiathar was a huge part of David's success. Next to the prophet Nathan, who was David's advisor, probably his number 2 advisor was Abiathar. And much of all the good things that came out of David, and much of all the good things that Israel has enjoyed even up to this day, are all because of this great man named Abiathar. He only lives because of Phinehas' wife. She had a difficult life. But because of her, a great man named Abiathar shows up later in the Bible. You notice that Abiathar has a miniature, not red, pink lightning strike. He sort of had a piece of the curse. For some reason, later in his life, he was still the priest, but later, the Bible doesn't explain why, but he decided when David and Nathan the prophet picked Solomon to be the next king, Abiathar decided to side with the underdog, a different son of David, and kind of backed into being part of a coup to try to prevent Solomon from getting on the throne. Not that he would have carried a sword or anything, but he kind of made friends with the wrong group in the palace, sort of a deal, kind of indirect. And when Solomon became king, Solomon executed all the men in the coup, all the leaders of the failed coup. When he got to Abiathar, he said, "You have been a great man. I know that David, much of David's success and my success growing up in the palace is because of you. So you are the one I will not execute. However, you will be exiled, and your family will be exiled. You'll be out in the desert somewhere. I don't know, I don't care, but I will never see you again." And that's what happened to the rest of the line of Abiathar. So a great man, but unfortunately still part of the curse. God was true to his word that the line of Eli never completely disappeared. When the people came back from the exile in 500 BC or so, they did a count. Remember, we read about all those counts when we studied Nehemiah. From the line of Ithamar, the fourth son of Aaron, there was a total of 1 priest that came back from the exile. So the line still existed. They weren't doing well, but God kept his word. They would decline, but they would not disappear. Oh, and I need to mention something about Zadok, so let me say just a word. So Zadok, after Abiathar, God moved the high priest line back onto the line of Eleazar and Phinehas I. In the middle of Abiathar's career, he was exiled, and Solomon either deliberately or unintentionally picked as his replacement none of his relatives, most of them of course had all been killed, picked someone from the line of Eleazar. So all of a sudden, the line of Eleazar is back being the high priestly line in keeping with the covenant that God had made hundreds of years before. God always keeps his word. And to this day, God has said, if we had a decent Israel nation, godly-wise, we would have a temple, and there would be priests in it, and they would all be from the line of Zadok. The book of Ezekiel says that when Christ comes at the second coming and becomes the ruler of the whole world, ruling from Jerusalem, sitting on the throne of David, he will be assisted by descendants of Zadok. They will be, what exactly they're doing is we don't know, but they will be assisting Jesus Christ in some way or another, even in the millennium. So God's promises never end. Applications, and this is the very last slide. Number one, our sin has consequences on our loved ones. Phinehas' wife suffered terribly, not because of what she was doing, but because of what her husband was doing. When you and I do the wrong thing, we may think, oh, I'll get over it. Well, you might, but that doesn't mean your loved ones will. Number two, when life is hard, we need to have a longer and a wider perspective. There's other things going on besides your unhappiness that are important. Number three, trust and obey. God always keeps his word. His promises always work. And he always tells us what to do next. So trust and obey. Let me close in prayer. God, thank you for being with us. I ask that you continue to bless us as we wrap up the service, and we look forward to you continuing to lead and guide us into this week. In Christ's name, amen.